Short answer, no. Longer, kind of more accurate answer, it really depends. So this is a topic that has come up so many times, especially because it has been literally the story of my life over the past 5-6 years, which is, do you have to live in Los Angeles to be a professional musician? I get this question a lot. I lived in LA for 5-ish years. I'm originally from New England, and also during the pandemic I moved up to Portland, Oregon. Now I'm in a little seaside town in Maine just on a temporary basis. So I've kind of been moving around, shuffling around, and I have kind of gathered some insights. So today is going to be just my perspective of the whole thing, kind of the pros and cons of living in Los Angeles as a professional musician, the reasons why I moved there, the reason why I left, and how I maintain my career now. So yeah, let's just get right into it. Just a little bit of background, I'm from the Boston area originally, and I grew up playing violin, so music has always been a part of my life. I always knew I wanted to do music. Basically what happened is, instead of going to music school, I just decided to kind of figure it out. I knew I wanted to make music my full-time job, and my brother lived in LA, had been living in LA since he graduated from Berkeley, and every time I would visit him in LA, I would inevitably end up getting session work, because they were just oh, Adam's sister is here and she plays violin, let's get her in on a session. So in my mind, I was if I'm going to be a professional musician, I have to go to LA. And simultaneously, I was listening to a lot of electronic music and a lot of hip hop at the time, and LA was just where all of my heroes were living. So I moved to LA when I was 21. And one of the reasons that I moved to LA at 21 instead of earlier is because every time I would visit my brother when I was under 21, the city seemed really restricted to me. I couldn't go anywhere. I couldn't go to any of the shows because they're all 21 plus. That's a topic for another day. I think it's really dumb. And yeah, the process of moving from my hometown to LA was very difficult. I had to break up a relationship of 2 years to go there, and I had to leave my job behind. I was a violin teacher. I had a lot of really sweet kiddos that I was teaching. So, it was definitely a big transition, but when I moved to LA, I had a ton of energy and a lot of drive to be okay, we're here, I gave up a lot to be here, let's do it, let's fucking go. And just so you guys know, it wasn't I moved to LA and suddenly everything was figured out. Literally the first place that I ended up was my brother's studio apartment. That was literally just a room, and I was sleeping on an air mattress for 2 months or something like that. Bless him for letting me crash there, but yeah, that was not sustainable. And then we moved to a place in North Hollywood that was a converted garage, and that ended up being kind of illegitimate and was cockroach infested, so that was tight. But yeah, I have stories. It goes kind of almost without saying, but one of the biggest attractors of LA to me was beat culture and the music industry there. That's what this whole video is about, right? So the thing about Los Angeles is that it is kind of the only city where there's a healthy beat scene. LA truly is that intersection between hip hop and jazz and electronic music, and those are all the styles of music that I'm I can't get enough of. So for me, it was oh my God, this is amazing. I remember the first time that I went to Low End Theory, I remember going to the airliner and walking upstairs and just feeling the bass and the subs thudding in my chest, and I was wow, this is the closest to church I think I've ever felt. So that was how I instantly fell in love with LA. And then on top of that, and this can be exemplified through the beat scene, is that LA has a level of diversity that is just really hard to find elsewhere. It's a huge city with people of all backgrounds, all kinds of stories. And there's something really amazing about being constantly surrounded by people who are so different from you, but have very similar interests. Everybody's there for pretty similar reasons, and so there's this kind of infectious energy that happens when you're in a room together. And I think just kind of like any other city, the energy of a city is wild. And not to mention the level of talent that is just everywhere. Your barista is like more talented than anybody that you went to high school with. You know what I mean? When I was living on the east side, I lived in a neighborhood called Highland Park, and there's like this little hole in the wall bar. It's like an oyster bar that is not supposed to be a venue, but they would have the most insane jazz players just there playing residencies. It's so unassuming, and I think that's like kind of one of the most unique things about LA is that you just like don't really get that anywhere else, where you just like walk into a bar and it's like legends are just around. And to that note too, for those who aren't already legends, there's just an unbelievable amount of motivation that you're just surrounded with all the time. Like I was saying earlier, like your barista is probably like more talented than anybody you went to high school with, and they're so motivated. Like the hustle is so real. You're watching these people in real life, seeing themselves to like as much potential as like they'll allow themselves. You know what I mean? It's pretty wild to witness, and it's very, very inspiring. And because everybody is pursuing something, there's this like super wide acceptance of working in the arts. There's no stigma to working in the arts. And for people who do work in the arts, it can feel like a really big sense of belonging, which I think is very attractive. My career would absolutely not look the way it does without LA. And a huge part of that, and I talk about this a lot in my lessons, in the workshops that I teach, that like building community is so, so important. And I think, you know, just by virtue of LA having this really, really powerful beat scene and having this extended music industry around it, it was fairly easy to build a community because it's just like you show up, you just keep showing up to shows, you keep making friends at shows, you keep playing these shows. Like one thing that I talk about a lot is learning how to be a good fan. Like if you can learn how to be a good fan, it's usually pretty easy to have that energy reciprocated. So like finding your community. And my community was hugely formative. For those of you who have been following me on Instagram for a while, I used to have this series called Sunday Sessions where I would just have these crazy instrumentalists like come in, make a beat with me, we'd make a video in a day. And that was so dependent on being in LA. And that in itself taught me so much. Like I was collaborating with people all the time, and not just anybody, but like world-class musicians. So I learned a lot about production in that time, and I think it really shaped me as a producer, not just working with these people, but like also going to local shows all the time. Those things were incredibly powerful to my education as a musician. And then kind of going back to like the energy thing, I mean, just being inspired all the time, that constant stream of inspiration, it's still something that fuels me, you know, like going to shows like that. And then the other thing, obviously, too, is had I not been in LA, there are just certain opportunities that I just would not have been around for. Like, LA does kind of have a way of throwing you last-minute gigs, and it's like, okay, can you fill in here? Or can you do this thing this weekend? That's not really the kind of work that I'm doing these days. But just for instance, it's like I had last-minute gig offers to do Hers strings for the Grammys, or like doing showcases at NAMM. So sometimes the logistics of literally just being around is like very useful. It really depends on what you're doing with your career. Like, are you a session player? Are you an engineer? Are you, a hired gun or anything like that? Being in LA is obviously hugely, hugely helpful. But obviously for me, and I know that there's a bunch of other people like me, I've built my career in a way where now most of the work that I'm doing is remote. Or if it is in LA, it's something that is like coordinated and planned ahead, and I can plan around it so that I can travel out there and be there for an allocated amount of time. It really depends on what you're trying to do. The other thing too is that there's no right way to do these things. Like, there's no set in stone way, because also we are living in pandemic times still, unfortunately. And we're learning a lot about like how we do things remotely. Because even as a string player, I'm still doing string session work remotely. Engineers can do things remotely. Producers can do things remotely. And everything that I'm doing right now, which is like everything having to do with being an artist. So I'm still working on tracks, working on new projects. I'm doing string work. I'm doing commercial work. These are all things that I can do from my charming little seaside town. But yeah, like there are plenty of people that don't live in LA that are pursuing music full time. There's plenty of them. them. These are all folks that come to LA occasionally to do work, but the vast majority of their work is done in their respective cities, which then asks the question, like, do you even have to live in a city to do these things? And again, it just really depends on what you're doing and like what kind of network that you have. For me, building my network in LA is what allowed me to move away from LA. So now I'm here, which is pretty neat. So the primary reason why I left LA, aside from the pandemic, because that did actually play a role in it, was that LA was just really overwhelming to me. I had been living there for 4.5, 5 years. And like, I lived in a great neighborhood. I lived on the east side. It was still relatively affordable while still being kind of like modest and also up and coming at the same time. But I had a lot of mixed feelings all the time. It was a very stressful place to live because it's a huge city, and even in a good neighborhood, there's still a lot of crime that happens. And then there are a lot of like moral issues. Like, I didn't personally feel great about being like part of the gentrification issue. And I also didn't feel great about like the rising amounts of homelessness in these neighborhoods. Really morally conflicted about my reactions to certain situations. And you hear on Twitter like all the time, you see people do it where they're like, if you don't like LA, then leave. We don't want you here. And I kind of got to a point where I was like, well, I don't really know if I like it. Like, I love certain parts of it, but a lot of this is very stressful to me. I kind of felt like I was contributing a little bit to the problem. So that's partially why I left. And just also full disclosure, like, these are topics that I'm not an expert in. There's a lot of nuance here that I can't really speak to. All I can say is that from my experience, I was living in a state of like high vigilance, especially as like a small female person. It was just too much for me. And then on top of that, not to be like all doomsday-ish about it, but like LA kind of is a hotspot, no pun intended, for like the very real effects of climate change. There is smog. There is smog so thick that you can't see the skyline from parts of the 134. It's not that many miles. Like, you should be able to see the skyline, and you can't. And then wildfire season is horrifying. And it's like, I never personally felt like I was in danger because I lived like in the city. But at the same time, there'd be days where I can't go out. I can't walk my dog because there's so much smoke in the air. There's just another level of stress. And then just on a cultural level, in terms of the music industry, if you find the right circles, that's great. But also, it's really easy to get swept up into the wrong circles, especially if people see value in you. Because like I said earlier, people are motivated, right? They are giving up everything in their lives to pursue their careers in Los Angeles. So if they kind of catch wind that you have like a certain amount of success, or that there's something that maybe they can like jump in on, there are definitely like sharks out there. And it can be really easy to be taken advantage of. I have seen so many of my friends being taken advantage of, and it breaks my heart every single fucking time. People promise things that they can't deliver. That happens a lot. Or they'll like get your labor and your work out of it and then not pay you accordingly, or not keep up their end of the deal. Like, it happens a lot, and it can be very, very soul crushing and discouraging. You've heard clout chasing, you know about ladder climbing. Like, people can be superficial. It's super real. So what am I doing about it now? What do I miss? Well, first and foremost, I really fucking miss my friends, that's for sure. I miss my friends, I miss the music so much. But simultaneously, when I moved to Portland, Oregon, I was kind of trying to like get out of the hustle and see if I could do things remotely. And it turns out that I could. It also turns out that I didn't really love living in Portland, Oregon. That's a story for another day. Nothing wrong with Portland, Oregon, it just wasn't for me. And so I ended up coming back to the Northeast to be like closer to family and see if I could combine kind of like my old life with my new life, of like my old life of being a New Englander with my new life of being like a professional producer that has a lot of roots in LA now. So I'm figuring it out. At the end of the day, moving to LA certainly helps. There's a lot that I would not have been able to do without going to LA. In fact, I think that had I not gone to LA, I just would not have the experience to speak on the things that I do. I was able to play those shows, go to those events, meet those people, network with those people, understand how networking works, navigate those networks. And I kind of hit a point where I was like, okay, this is enough for now. And would I ever move back to LA? Most likely not, especially because it is getting more expensive. The climate physically gets to me. Like, sometimes I get this scratchy feeling in my throat, and it's literally just from the smog. But I'm not closed to the idea. So I got a lot of really good questions here, and I'm just going to go through some of them. Leeway in Sleep asks, aren't there other options like New York? Yes, there are. No, but really, it just depends. I mean, it depends on what aspect of the music industry you're trying to break into. There's obviously a music industry in New York, and there's a lot of work that's done between New York and LA. I would just say that they're different music cultures. That's at least what I've picked up from it thus far. And also, just in terms of living conditions, very, very different vibe. Max asks, is it better to start in a major city and save other places for when you're more established? That's a good question. I mean, it really depends on what you're trying to achieve. I didn't pick LA because it's a large city. I picked LA because I already had a strong connect there, which was my brother. And also at the same time, I knew that there just isn't a ceiling in LA. We talk about the big fish in a small pond thing, and in LA is like a limitless ocean. Like, you will never be too big for LA. So I think that was also part of the appeal of it. But yeah, there's definitely other cities that you can like either work your way up into going to LA, or that if you go to LA and you build enough of a resume and, you know, something to show for it, that going to other cities is a little easier. It depends on what you're trying to do. Hector asks, how talented or skilled do you need to be? That's a great question, because in my opinion, talent actually has kind of very little to do with it. I would say that work ethic and drive and being smart about it, and also being a good person, like being a good hang, somebody who's like good to work with, those things count for a lot. Obviously, it helps to be talented, but I mean, there's nothing that you can't not work for. I don't know if that was a double negative. Anyway, all I'm saying is that if you have the work ethic, like, you can practice enough to be good enough to work with. You don't have to be a superstar prodigy in order to get work in LA. You just have to have like a good sensibility about you and the drive to get better. Beats by Wandrew asks, how's the music scene in Maine? That's a great question, because I don't know. I'm trying to figure that out myself. So if anybody knows what's going on, like, let me know, please. What about sound engineers? Do you need to be there to be able to get recognized? You don't need to be there to be able to get recognized. It certainly helps. It's kind of like a speed boost to the probability that you'll be able to build your resume. But again, none of this stuff is guaranteed. The other thing too is that you could get really good as a sound engineer in your own city and have a really dope resume to show for it, or just like a really good marketing campaign of like how to get yourself known in that way. But you know, I can only speak to it so much because it's like I have worked in studios, but most of my work has been largely from home. So, you know, it just really depends. Igaito asks, is a musician's network or reputation more or less important than their skill? You know, obviously you have to have a certain amount of skill to get the work that you do. But yeah, like having the network and having a reputation goes a really long way. You want to be somebody who is good to work with. And LA provides opportunities to get better at it. That's one of the things that is really helpful about being in that city. But that's not to say that you can't do that elsewhere. And then Nathaniel M. Hubbard asks, it's more about the connections and wherever you have the best sense of community, isn't it? Yeah, that's a really good way to put it. I would say that's kind of like the summary of this video in a lot of ways. Like, LA provides opportunities, for sure. But yeah, it totally just depends on your network and where your sense of community is, and you can make it work kind of from wherever, to be honest. Thank you guys so much for watching, and I hope that this was insightful in any capacity. Again, this is just from my perspective, but I think at the end of the day, what I want you guys to walk away with is that it is possible to live where you need to, that makes you feel whole, while simultaneously pursuing this career. That's something that I've had to teach myself over and over and over again. But I also do have to give props to LA, where props are due. Like, I would not be the same musician without LA. I would not have been as inspired. I would not have learned as much so quickly. And yeah, it was tough. It was tough in a lot of ways, but I wouldn't give up those years for anything. And, do I wish that I had a little bit more endurance to live in a big city like that? Yeah, sure. I mean, there's a lot of things that would be great about still being there. But that's just not who I am. I need a slower pace of life in order to keep this as a sustainable career. And that's just where I'm at.